Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People's Story. My family's ranch has been in our possession for nearly a century. My great-grandfather purchased these 40 acres back in 1936, and it's been passed down through generations. I inherited it from my father 5 years ago, and I've been living here peacefully ever since. The property sits about an hour outside of Houston, far enough to enjoy rural living, but close enough to commute to the city when needed. When I first moved in, the area around my land was mostly undeveloped, just a few scattered farms and ranches. But in the last couple of years, a developer bought the adjacent 100 acres and built Whispering Pines, one of those cookie-cutter luxury housing communities with fancy entrance gates and ridiculously large houses on tiny plots of land. I didn't mind the development at first. Sure, the construction was noisy, but I figured once people moved in, things would quiet down. Boy, was I wrong. About 6 months after the houses were finished and families moved in, I started noticing strange things happening on my property. People I didn't know were walking their dogs along the creek that runs through my land. Kids were riding bikes across my pasture. One Saturday, I even found a couple having a picnic under the big oak tree near my fence line. The first few times, I was polite. I'd walk over and calmly explain that they were on private property. "Oh, we didn't know," was the typical response, followed by them packing up and leaving. But then I'd see the same people back again a few days later. It got annoying quickly. Things came to a head one weekend when I discovered a group of about 10 people setting up what looked like a birthday party under the oak tree. They had tables, chairs, a cake, balloons, the works. I approached them, trying to keep my cool. "Excuse me, folks, but this is private property. You can't have your party here." A woman who I would later learn was named Karen, of course, stepped forward with an incredulous look on her face. "What do you mean? This is community land. The HOA told us we could use it." I blinked in confusion. "HOA? I'm not part of any HOA. This is my ranch. My family has owned it for generations." Karen rolled her eyes like I was the stupid one. "Well, obviously things have changed. The HOA president said all this land," she gestured widely around her, "is now designated as community green space for Whispering Pines residents." My blood began to boil, but I kept my voice steady. "Ma'am, I don't know what your HOA president told you, but they lied. This is my private property and you all need to leave now." "I'm calling Richard," she huffed, pulling out her phone. Richard, as it turned out, was the HOA president. While she was on the phone, I noticed more people arriving with gifts and food. This situation was getting out of hand fast. Karen thrust her phone at me. "Here, talk to Richard. He'll explain everything." I took the phone. "Hello?" "Yes, hi there," came a smooth, condescending voice. "I understand there's some confusion about the community green space." "There's no confusion on my part," I replied firmly. "This is my private property. I have the deed. My family has owned it for nearly 100 years. Your residents are trespassing." Richard chuckled like we were old friends having a minor misunderstanding. "Well, you see, when our development was approved, the county rezoned that area for public use. It's designated as a conservation easement now. We've been informing our residents they're welcome to enjoy the natural setting. It's all completely above board." I was stunned. This was the first I'd heard of any rezoning. "That's impossible. I never received any notification about rezoning, and I certainly never agreed to it." "Well, these things happen in the bureaucratic shuffle," Richard said dismissively. "But the paperwork's all been filed. If you have concerns, you can take them up with the county on Monday. In the meantime, I'd appreciate if you'd allow our residents to enjoy their gathering." Before I could respond, he hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, absolutely fuming. I turned back to Karen and her party guests. "I don't care what Richard told you. This is my land and you are all trespassing. Pack up and leave now, or I'm calling the sheriff." Karen scoffed. "Go ahead, call them. They'll tell you the same thing Richard did. This is community property now." So that's exactly what I did. While waiting for the sheriff's deputy to arrive, I went back to my house and dug through my filing cabinet for my property deed and tax records. No way was I letting these people steal my land through some made-up rezoning scheme. The deputy, a no-nonsense woman named Officer Martinez, arrived about 20 minutes later. I showed her my documentation and explained the situation. "Let me go talk to them," she said, walking over to the party group. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see Karen's animated gestures and the increasingly frustrated expressions of the other guests. After about 10 minutes, Officer Martinez returned with Karen in tow. "Sir," Officer Martinez began, "I've explained to Miss Thompson here that your property records are in order, and there's no record of any rezoning or conservation easement on file with the county. These people are indeed trespassing on private property." Karen's face was red with indignation. "This is ridiculous. Richard wouldn't lie about something like this." "Miss Thompson, Officer Martinez said firmly. "I'm going to have to ask you and your guests to pack up and leave now. Failure to do so could result in trespassing charges." Reluctantly, the partygoers began gathering their things. As they left, I overheard snippets of conversation about how I was ruining a child's birthday and how selfish I was being. After they were gone, Officer Martinez turned to me. "You might want to put up some clearer no trespassing signs. And I'd recommend talking to a lawyer about this situation with the HOA. It sounds like they've been misrepresenting your property to their residents." I thanked her for her help and she left. That evening, I called my cousin, who happens to be a real estate attorney. She was as confused as I was about the HOA claims and promised to look into it first thing Monday morning. Sure enough, Monday came with more unwelcome revelations. My cousin called after checking with the county records office. "So here's what happened," she explained. "The developer of Whispering Pines actually tried to file for rezoning of your property as a conservation easement, claiming it was part of their original land purchase. The application was denied because they couldn't provide proof of ownership, but it looks like they're proceeding as if it was approved." "How is that even possible?" I asked, dumbfounded. "It's not, legally speaking, but if they're telling all their residents that your land is community property, they clearly don't care about the legal part. This is a blatant land grab attempt." She recommended sending a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA and installing better security measures around my property. "And document everything," she advised. "Every trespasser, every interaction with the HOA, everything." Over the next week, I put up dozens of clearly visible, private property, no trespassing signs along my property line. I also sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA detailing my ownership of the land and demanding they stop telling residents they could use my property. Their response came in the form of a letter from their attorney claiming that the ranch was traditionally used by area residents for recreation, completely false, and that recent zoning changes allowed for public access to significant natural features like the creek on my property. It was all legal mumbo-jumbo designed to sound official while saying nothing of substance. Meanwhile, the trespassing continued. If anything, it got worse. Now people would point to the no trespassing signs and laugh as they walked past them. I confronted several groups, only to be told that Richard said those signs aren't valid or the HOA told us to ignore those. I called the sheriff's office so many times they started recognizing my voice. Each time, deputies would come out and escort trespassers off my property, but they couldn't station someone here 24/7. As soon as law enforcement left, new trespassers would arrive. One morning, I woke up to find a path had been mowed through my tallgrass prairie area, a section I deliberately kept wild as a habitat for local wildlife. Someone had actually brought a riding mower onto my property and cut a winding trail about 6 feet wide through the heart of it. That was the final straw. I called a fencing company that day and arranged for them to install an 8-foot chain-link fence around the entire perimeter of my property. It wasn't cheap, but it was necessary. While I was at it, I also contacted a security company to install cameras and an electric gate at the driveway entrance. The fencing crew started work the following Monday. By Wednesday, they had completed about half the perimeter. That evening, I received a visit from Richard himself, the HOA president I'd only spoken to on the phone before. He pulled up in a shiny black Lexus, dressed like he was heading to a country club in his polo shirt and pressed khakis. I was covered in dirt from working in my vegetable garden when I walked over to meet him at the edge of my driveway. "What can I do for you?" I asked, not bothering to hide the annoyance in my voice. Richard flashed what I'm sure he thought was a charming smile. "I thought it was time we met in person to clear up this little misunderstanding. I'm Richard Blackwell, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." "There's no misunderstanding," I replied. "You've been telling people they can trespass on my property and I want it to stop." Richard's smile didn't waver. "You see, that's where we disagree. When Whispering Pines was developed, the natural beauty of this area was a major selling point. The creek, the meadows, the trees, all of these were featured prominently in our marketing materials. Your marketing materials don't override my property rights," I pointed out. "Perhaps not technically," he conceded, "but our homeowners purchase their properties with certain expectations. The average home in Whispering Pines costs over $800,000. People paying that kind of money expect amenities." I crossed my arms. "My land is not an amenity for your residents." "What if we came to an arrangement?" Richard proposed. "The HOA could pay you a yearly fee to allow our residents access to certain parts of your property. We could draw up an official agreement, make everything nice and legal." I considered this for about 2 seconds. "No." Richard's smile finally faltered. "No? Just like that?" "Just like that. This land has been in my family for generations. It's not a park, it's not a playground, and it's not for sale or rent. His expression hardened. I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. Our HOA has considerable resources and influence in this county. We've managed to get zoning laws changed, building permits fast-tracked, all sorts of things. Is that a threat? I asked. It's a reality check, Richard replied. That fence you're putting up? I could have construction halted with one phone call claiming it violates local ordinances. I stepped closer to him. Let me give you a reality check, Richard. This is private property. Your HOA has zero authority here. You've been lying to your residents and encouraging them to break the law by trespassing. If you or any of your people set foot on my land again without permission, I'll press charges. And if you interfere with my fence in any way, I'll sue you personally, not just your precious HOA. Richard's face reddened. You'll regret taking this stance, he warned before turning back to his Lexus and speeding away. True to his word, the next morning a county inspector showed up claiming there had been a complaint about my fence. But I had done my homework. The fence was entirely on my property and well within county regulations. After checking the permits and measurements, the inspector signed off on it and left. The fence was completed by the end of the week, along with a heavy-duty electric gate at the entrance to my driveway. I also installed security cameras covering the entire perimeter and motion-activated floodlights at key points, but I knew a fence alone wouldn't be enough to deter the entitled Whispering Pines residents. So I made one more addition to my security setup. I adopted 2 German Shepherds from a rescue organization specializing in retired police dogs. Thor and Valkyrie were magnificent animals. Well-trained, obedient to me, but intimidating to strangers. I posted clear signs along the fence. Warning: property protected by security cameras and guard dogs. Trespassers will be prosecuted. For good measure, I added electric fence signs too, even though the fence wasn't actually electrified. Sometimes the suggestion of a shock is enough deterrent. The results were immediate and satisfying. The first weekend after completing my security upgrades, I watched on my new camera system as several groups of Whispering Pines residents approached my fence, saw the signs, noticed the cameras, and turned away. A few braver souls tested the gates only to find them securely locked. But then came the inevitable escalation. Sunday afternoon, my security system alerted me to movement at the back corner of my property. On the camera feed, I could see 3 teenage boys attempting to climb over the fence. I grabbed the dogs' leashes and headed out. By the time I reached the location, 2 of the teens had already dropped down onto my side of the fence. The third was straddling the top. You boys want to explain what you're doing? I called out as I approached, Thor and Valkyrie walking obediently beside me. The sight of 2 large German Shepherds was apparently enough to trigger an immediate reassessment of their plans. The teen on the fence scrambled back to the other side, while the 2 on my property backed away slowly. The dogs won't hurt you if you don't run, I assured them, but they will chase you if you do. Now, there's a gate about 50 yards that way. I'm going to unlock it, and you're going to leave. And if I catch you trespassing again, I'll call the sheriff. Understood? They nodded nervously, eyes fixed on Thor and Valkyrie, who were watching them intently but making no aggressive moves. I escorted them to the gate, unlocked it, and watched them hurry back toward Whispering Pines. Then I called the security company and asked them to install additional cameras in that corner of the property. The next day, I received an official notice from the Whispering Pines HOA claiming that my aggressive security measures were causing community distress and demanding that I remove the dangerous animals and intimidating surveillance equipment from my property. It was printed on official-looking letterhead and signed by Richard and the HOA board. I showed it to my cousin, who laughed out loud. They really don't give up, do they? This has absolutely no legal weight. They might as well have written it on toilet paper. But the HOA wasn't done. Over the next few weeks, they tried everything they could think of to force me to remove my security measures. They filed complaints with animal control, claiming my dogs were vicious. Inspection found them to be well-trained and properly contained. They reported me to the county for excessive lighting from my security floodlights. Inspection found them to be within regulations. They even tried to claim my fence height violated some obscure ordinance. It didn't. Each time, inspectors would come out, find nothing wrong, and leave. And each time, I documented the harassment. The most absurd attempt came when Richard himself called the sheriff claiming my electric fence had injured a child. When deputies arrived, I showed them that the fence wasn't actually electrified at all. The signs were just a deterrent. The deputies were not amused by the false report and warned Richard about misusing emergency services. Throughout all this, one thing became increasingly clear. The HOA was desperate to gain access to my land, and they weren't going to give up easily. I needed to understand why they were so fixated on my property specifically. My cousin suggested hiring a private investigator to look into the development's history and the HOA finances. It seemed excessive, but at this point I was willing to try anything to end the harassment. The PI's findings were illuminating, to say the least. It turned out that when the developer was selling homes in Whispering Pines, they had indeed marketed the community as having access to a natural recreation area along the creek. They had included photos of my property in their brochures and promotional materials without my knowledge or consent. Even more damning, they had collected a significant upcharge on each home, about $30,000 per property, for this supposed creek access amenity. With over 100 homes in the development, that amounted to more than $3 million in additional profit based on a false promise. No wonder Richard was so desperate to secure access to my land. If homeowners realized they'd paid a premium for something that didn't exist, the HOA, and potentially the developer, could face serious legal consequences. Armed with this information, I had my lawyer send a new letter to the HOA. This one detailed everything we'd discovered about their fraudulent marketing and illegal trespassing encouragement. It demanded an immediate end to all harassment, a formal acknowledgement to all Whispering Pines residents that my property was private, and a significant payment to compensate for the damages and stress they'd caused. We gave them 1 week to respond before we would file a lawsuit and contact state authorities about their fraudulent business practices. The response came not from the HOA lawyer, but from Richard himself. He requested a meeting on neutral ground, a local coffee shop, to discuss a resolution. I agreed, but insisted on bringing my lawyer. Richard showed up with his attorney, looking considerably less confident than during our previous encounter. "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot," he began after we'd settled at a corner table. "There's been some unfortunate miscommunication regarding your property." "Miscommunication?" I repeated incredulously. "You deliberately misled your residents about my land and encouraged them to trespass. You tried to intimidate me when I stood up for my property rights. That's not miscommunication, it's fraud and harassment," Richard's attorney interjected smoothly. "What my client means is that there was a misunderstanding during the development phase about the status of the land adjacent to Whispering Pines. The previous developer may have made certain assumptions about future land use." My lawyer wasn't having it. Assumptions that translated into a $30,000 premium on each home sold under false pretenses. That's textbook fraud. Richard looked uncomfortable. "We're prepared to make this right. The HOA is willing to issue a formal statement to all residents clarifying that your property is private and not to be accessed. We'll pay for any damages incurred to your land. And we're prepared to offer compensation for the inconvenience, say $50,000? I almost laughed. "Not even close. Your residents have been trespassing on my property for months. You've filed false reports with county officials and emergency services. You've harassed me continuously, and you've profited millions from lying about my land." After nearly 2 hours of negotiation, we finally reached an agreement. The HOA would 1. Issue an immediate and unequivocal statement to all residents that my property was private and off-limits. 2. Pay $250,000 in damages and compensation for the harassment. 3. Cover all costs for my security measures, fence, cameras, gate. 4. Maintain a 30-foot landscaped buffer zone between my property and Whispering Pines at their expense. 5. Sign a legally binding agreement never to contest my property rights in the future. In return, I agreed not to pursue legal action against them or report their fraudulent practices to state authorities. Richard looked like he'd swallowed something bitter as he signed the agreement, but he had no choice. The alternative was a class action lawsuit from homeowners who discovered they'd been defrauded, potentially costing the HOA and developer millions more than our settlement. The following week, every Whispering Pines resident received a formal letter from the HOA explaining that my property was private and strictly off-limits. The letter included a map clearly showing the boundaries and warnings about the legal consequences of trespassing. The trespassing stopped immediately. Apparently, when Richard wasn't actively encouraging residents to ignore my property rights, they were capable of respecting boundaries after all. With the settlement money, I made some improvements to my ranch that I'd been putting off. I renovated the old barn, expanded my vegetable garden, and set up a proper training area for Thor and Valkyrie, who had proven themselves to be excellent guardians. The irony wasn't lost on me that I now had a more secure and improved property thanks to the HOA attempted land grab. As for Richard, he resigned from the HOA board shortly after our settlement, citing personal reasons. I heard through the grapevine that several homeowners had started asking uncomfortable questions about that creek access amenity they'd paid extra for, and Richard decided to step down before things got ugly. Sometimes I see my former trespassers walking along the public road that runs past my property. They look longingly at the creek and meadows they briefly thought were theirs to enjoy. Some wave awkwardly when they see me. Others pretend not to notice me at all. I don't bear them any ill will. Most were just misled by Richard and the HOA, but I do enjoy the peace and privacy that my fence, gates, cameras, and canine companions have restored to my family's land. My great-grandfather bought this property during the Great Depression, working 3 jobs to make the payments. My grandfather expanded it during the post-war boom. My father maintained it through good times and bad, and I'll be damned if I let some entitled HOA president take even an inch of it without a fight. In the end, I didn't just protect my property, I came out ahead. My land is more secure, my finances are healthier, and the HOA learned an expensive lesson about respecting property rights. As for Thor and Valkyrie, they still patrol the fence line every day, keeping watch for trespassers that no longer come. But they seem to enjoy their job anyway, and I certainly sleep better knowing they're on duty. Update, 6 months later. It's been about 6 months since the settlement with the Whispering Pines HOA, and I figured I'd share an update on how things have played out since then. The landscaped buffer zone between my property and Whispering Pines was completed last month, and I have to admit it looks pretty good. The HOA hired a legitimate landscaping company that planted rows of native trees and shrubs along the entire boundary. It actually provides me with more privacy than the fence alone, and since they're responsible for maintaining it, I don't have to lift a finger. Something unexpected happened about 2 months after our settlement. I was working in my barn when a hesitant knock came at my gate. I checked the security camera and saw a middle-aged couple I didn't recognize standing outside. I approached cautiously with Thor and Valkyrie at my side. "Can I help you?" I asked through the gate. The man stepped forward. "Hi, I'm Doug Miller and this is my wife Sheila. We moved into Whispering Pines about 3 months ago and... Well, we just found out about the situation with your property." Sheila nodded. "We paid an extra $30,000 for the creek access amenity when we bought our house. The realtor showed us pictures of your land and told us it was community property." I tensed up, wondering if this was the start of new problems. "Well, as you now know, that was false advertising. This is private property." "Absolutely," Doug agreed quickly. "We're not here to argue that. Actually, we're leading a group of homeowners who are preparing a class action lawsuit against the developer and the former HOA board for fraud. That caught my attention." "Really?" "Yes," Sheila explained. "After that letter went out about your property being off limits, a lot of us started asking questions. We discovered that the developer and original HOA board members, including Richard, knew all along that they didn't have rights to your land. We have emails proving they continued marketing the creek access even after you explicitly denied permission." Doug handed me a folder. "We've gathered evidence from over 60 homeowners who all paid the premium for something that didn't exist. We were hoping you might be willing to provide a statement about your interactions with the HOA, especially Richard." I looked through the folder, impressed by their thoroughness. "I'll need to talk to my lawyer about this, but I'm definitely interested. Richard and his cronies shouldn't get away with defrauding all of you." We exchanged contact information, and after consulting with my cousin, I provided a detailed statement for their lawsuit. I made sure to include dates, times, and exact quotes from my interactions with Richard, along with copies of their fraudulent notices and complaints. The class action suit moved forward quickly. Many homeowners had kept their purchase agreements explicitly mentioning the creek access amenity with photos of my property. Combined with the marketing materials and my statement, they had an airtight case. 3 months into the legal proceedings, the developer offered a settlement. Full refunds of the $30,000 premium to all homeowners, plus $10,000 each for damages. The total came to over $4 million. Rather than risk an even larger judgment at trial, the developer agreed to pay. But here's the really satisfying part. As part of the settlement terms, the homeowners demanded a full investigation into Richard and the original HOA board members. It turned out that Richard had received a substantial kickback from the developer for helping maintain the creek access lie, nearly $500,000 over 3 years. He was charged with fraud and misappropriation of HOA funds. Last month, Richard pleaded guilty to avoid a trial. He was sentenced to pay back all the money, plus a hefty fine, and received 2 years of probation. He also had to sell his house in Whispering Pines to cover his legal expenses and restitution. I heard he moved to another state, probably to escape the humiliation. The new HOA board, led by Doug and several other reasonable homeowners, has been nothing but respectful. They even reached out to propose a legitimate business arrangement. They wanted to know if I'd be interested in hosting occasional guided nature walks on a small designated trail on my property for which they'd pay a fair fee. I thought about it for a while and eventually agreed, but on my terms. Once a month, I allow a small group, maximum 15 people, to take a guided tour along a specific trail that I created, well away from my house and barn. They sign liability waivers, pay a reasonable fee, and follow strict rules. No wandering off the path, no littering, no bothering the animals. Thor and Valkyrie and I lead each tour personally, explaining the history of the ranch and pointing out interesting features of the native landscape. Surprisingly, it's become something I actually enjoy. Most of the residents are genuinely interested in learning about the land and they respect the boundaries I've set. The tour income provides a nice additional revenue stream for the ranch, and I get to educate people about sustainable land management and local wildlife. One unexpected outcome. 3 families from Whispering Pines have started buying fresh eggs and vegetables from me. I had always grown more than I needed for myself, and now I have regular customers who appreciate locally grown produce. I've even expanded my vegetable garden to meet the growing demand. The security measures I installed remain in place, of course. The electric gate, cameras, and fence give me peace of mind, and Thor and Valkyrie continue to patrol the property diligently. But these days, they're more likely to be greeting scheduled visitors than chasing off trespassers. Last week, I received an official letter from the county records office. They've updated their maps and property records to include prominent notations that my entire ranch is private property with no public easements or access rights. This extra layer of protection ensures that no future developer or HOA can try the same stunt again. I also discovered that my property value has actually increased substantially due to the development next door. If I ever decided to sell, which I won't, I could ask nearly double what the land was worth before Whispering Pines was built. The irony isn't lost on me that Richard's attempted land grab has made me considerably wealthier on paper. My cousin, whose legal advice was invaluable throughout this ordeal, suggested I create a trust to ensure the ranch stays in the family for generations to come. I've started that process with specific provisions to protect against future encroachment attempts. Sometimes when I'm out working the land, I look at the fence line and the now thriving buffer of trees and shrubs. Beyond it, I can see the rooftops of Whispering Pines with their perfectly manicured lawns and cookie-cutter houses. I still prefer my side of the fence, the open space, the wild areas, the connection to land that's been in my family for nearly a century, but I've made my peace with having neighbors. The good ones respect boundaries and appreciate what they can legitimately access. The entitled ones like Richard have learned expensive lessons about property rights and the consequences of fraud. As for me, I've learned that standing firm doesn't mean you can't eventually find common ground. I protected what was mine without compromise, but once that battle was decisively won, I found a way to build a relationship with my neighbors that benefits everyone involved. Thor and Valkyrie seem to have adjusted well to their expanded roles too. They're still intimidating security dogs when needed, but they've also become ambassadors of sorts during the guided tours. The children especially love them, and the dogs soak up the attention like the good boys they are. Looking back, I'm grateful for a few things. My family's foresight in holding onto this land, my own stubbornness in defending it, and the security measures that forced the HOA to back down. I'm also thankful for neighbors like Doug and Sheila who recognized the wrong that had been done and took action to make it right. My great-grandfather used to say that good fences make good neighbors. In my case, it took an 8-foot chain-link fence, security cameras, electric gates, and 2 German shepherds to make that happen. But now that the boundaries are clear and respected, I can finally enjoy my property the way my family has for generations, in peace, but now with the occasional guided tour. And every month when I deposit the tour fees and produce sales money, I can't help but smile thinking about Richard, who tried to take my land for free and ended up losing everything instead. Sometimes justice works out exactly as it should. The next one is a malicious compliances story. I work as a support manager for a company that sells credit card readers and other services for processing money. Our story starts with a phone call that one of our newest staff members received. The caller does not introduce themselves and instead loudly demands to speak to no less than the CEO of the company and will not give any information aside from his repeated demands and some indirect swearing. Normally, this would earn them a terminated call, but I want to know who has the balls to scream at my staff, so I have him transferred over. Having had some of these calls before, I introduce myself with a very fancy title and ensure the caller that whatever his support needs are, I can handle them without any issue. The CEO is busy at the moment, and I am next in line in the support organization. This is not entirely true, but it works to calm people down and get them to tell me what is actually wrong. The caller is named Steve, not just any Steve, mind you, but Steve, the owner of Steve's Cafe. And not just one Steve's Cafe, mind you, but the owner of all 7 Steve's Cafes. Steve is offended that he was given to me and not the CEO like he demanded. He is the owner you see and needs to talk to my owner, not me. I don't own 7 cafes and I certainly don't own my company. So I can't understand Steve's needs and can't make the hard choices he needs made. I again assure him that I do have the position and authority to do anything he requires. I am the manager of the support department. I can make any changes he requires. I can set up new accounts or order new devices, anything. He only needs to tell me his problems and I will provide solutions. I will support him. The words are immediate and aggressive. Can you cancel my accounts? Well, yes I can. I inform him that we need a written request to cancel. I also try to inquire why he needs to cancel his accounts. This is standard procedure. If he wants to close his account, then we close his account, but any feedback is useful. Is he leaving because our product was bad? Because our service was bad? Because he found a better deal? But before I can get more than a few words out, he shouts again, "Have call me! He has my number!" And he disconnects. I report this up the chain. No email means no cancellation. But still, bosses need to know. First thing next morning, I get invited to an emergency meeting by the CEO, as well as a few other pertinent admins. We go over what happened, then I am shown an email. Steve managed to find the CEO's internal email address and sent him an email complaining about one of his 7 stores having a horrible time with the product. He is demanding no less than the cancellation of all his accounts and a refund for 3 months of payments he has made for each, as the product is totally unusable. I check the logs. The problem location does indeed have a problem. That started yesterday morning. They are not down, but they are having a bad time. There are no emails or calls informing us, just the screaming cancellation request. I send over the call logs, and we listen to Steve scream and curse at the support agent before he got sent to me, and then I hear 2 words that cue the malicious compliance. Cancel them. The meeting goes quiet. The CEO has spoken. We cancel all 7 accounts and shut down services. They start their day with devices that do not work. The calls come in. Again, the CEO speaks. That account is canceled. Follow procedure. So each manager calls me frantically explaining that nothing is working. The staff apologetically tell them that their account was canceled per their owner's email. We can no longer provide support. Shortly thereafter, the owner calls in, once again screaming to turn them back on. Uncancel them this instant. Get the devices working. He is losing money. I check with the CEO, and after receiving a nod, I say, "Per your request made over the phone yesterday and your email this morning, your accounts have been canceled." Steve just gets madder and says he didn't mean to actually cancel them. He just wanted to let us know what would happen if we didn't fix his issue. He continues to yell. I let the CEO know, and at his request, I transfer Steve to his office phone. I wish there was a satisfying ending to this story, but Steve and our boss talked. Steve was informed that his behavior was unacceptable. Steve admitted that he was expecting expedited service and possibly a discount when he threatened to cancel. He didn't really want to cancel his accounts, he just wanted support to take him seriously and transfer him up the chain so he could get faster, better service. There was no real apology, though both I and the initial support agent were told that Steve would behave himself from now on and to report if he didn't. Services were resumed and all 7 locations were opened a bit late. The one location that did have issues yesterday got on the phone with a support agent and were sorted out in a reasonable amount of time. All is right in heaven and earth, but I do hope Steve learned that threatening to cancel your account sometimes leads to you canceling your account and not to a discount. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.